Brains. Brains. Num 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 num. Up next in my Amicus anthology horror review series is Tales from the Crypt. Tales from the Crypt was released in 1972. It was named after the horror comic of the 1950s, which had the same name, and it was directed by Freddie Francis. This would be the third anthology horror film that Freddie Francis would direct for Amicus, and it would also be his last, having previously directed Dr. Terror's House of Horrors and Torture Garden. Freddie Francis would go on to do another anthology horror film shortly afterwards called Tales That Witness Madness, but that film was not actually made by Amicus, even though it's often mistakenly seen as being part of the series. The writing duties this time were taken up by Milton Subotsky, who was one of the co-founders of Amicus, although many of the stories, in fact all the stories, come from some of the EC comics of the 1950s. Interestingly, only two of the stories actually took place within the Tales from the Crypt comic. The other ones were actually seen in Vault of Horror, which would actually go on to be the basis of the following Amicus anthology horror film. The cinematographer was Daniel Warwick, who also worked with Freddie Francis on Torture Garden, and the music was composed by Douglas Gamley, I think that's his name, who was actually already quite well established within Amicus Studios. I know you guys probably get sick and tired of me defining what it is, but Tales from the Crypt is an anthology horror film. An anthology horror film is a film which has a wraparound story, which then contains smaller, shorter stories which are all threaded together somehow by the wraparound. In Tales from the Crypt, the wraparound follows 5 tourists who are being led as part of a larger party through underground catacombs by a tour guide, and they sort of wander off away from the main group, and they find themselves in this isolated chamber. And when they're in this isolated chamber, they are confronted by the Crypt Keeper, who is played by Ralph Richardson. The Crypt Keeper is this hooded character who then goes through each of the 5 tourists and shows them what their future may bring. It normally ends in something quite gruesome. While Ralph Richardson is always a joy to watch, he is kind of underused in this film. He does give a sort of otherworldly, eccentric feeling to the Crypt Keeper, but if you have watched the TV series Tales from the Crypt, or you have read any of the comics, he doesn't really come across as the Crypt Keeper as you're maybe used to. But you know, still he sort of plays the character sort of off balance and very deadpan, and because of that it is effective, but you know, really probably anyone could have played that character, and I think Ralph Richardson's kind of wasted in the role a little bit. It's also probably one of the quickest of the Amicus films to jump right into the shorter stories which are contained by the wraparound. It sort of gets straight there right away and just starts telling what's happening to these five individuals, and I think because of that the wraparound really is quite weak in some ways, even though it should be the most iconic because it's Tales from the Crypt, which is the most famous of those anthology horror comic books. It doesn't really feel as iconic as it should be, and it does feel kind of, at times I think the wraparound kind of feels a little bit cobbled together. Although I still really enjoy it, I still really enjoy the atmosphere, it's just that there's not really much there to sort of explore. The first person that the Crypt Keeper tells their fate to is Joan Collins. Now, not Joan Collins herself, but you know, she's her character. Now, Joan Collins plays a character who, as we see as the story plays out, she is a mother who plots to kill her husband on a sort of Christmas night, and at the same time as she's plotting to do this, there's rumoured to be a maniac on the loose in the neighbourhood. So the two stories, sort of her being trying to be a killer and this maniac on the loose, really sort of combine, which is quite interesting because in a lot of ways, you know, you're not supposed to you're not supposed to really feel for Joan Collins' character because, you know, she's a murderer, but you do feel like as you're watching it, you know, when quite inevitably, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that obviously the maniac turns up at some point, and when that happens, you know, you do sort of like kind of want her to get away in a way, but then it's weird, then there's also bits where you're like that, no, get her, you know. So it's a strange story. It's actually one of the most famous out of all anthology horror stories. It's one which has been, it was printed originally, I think, in the EC Comics, and it was, in fact, I think it might have been the Vault of Horror though, that not Tales from the Crypt it was printed in. I need to check that, but it was one of the EC Comics it was printed in. It was adapted for this film. It's also been used, you may have seen it in the Tales from the Crypt television series. So it is a story that you might be familiar with. I do enjoy it. I don't think it's as amazing as some people make out. I think it's very, very solid, but it's certainly, you know, one of the most famous stories within anthology horror. Joan Collins gives a great performance, and really the contrast between this horrible murderous event and the sort of Christmas surroundings that you normally associate with sort of peace and tranquility, that's really enjoyable. We have to remember that this was in 1972, and I actually think that this story has had an influence on cinema in some ways. I think that in some respects it's affected the slasher genre, and perhaps been partly involved in helping sort of create that, but probably in a very subtle way. But I do feel as if its effect has been seen in later films. The second story that the Crypt Keeper tells stars Carl Maitland, and it's about a man who is having an affair. Now, we see him at the beginning sort of being a bit of a family man, children, wife, all that sort of stuff, and then he leaves them as if he's going on a business trip, and then gets in the car with his mistress. There's then a car accident, and the rest of the film plays out from his point of view, which is quite interesting. And I mean from his point of view as in all the shots are kind of first person. So it's a really interesting story. I actually love this one. I think it's decidedly creepy. I think it's everything that anthology horror comics are. I used to read the one-off Eagle stories as a kid, and this totally could have been there, but I mean obviously that, you know, the stories from much earlier than that. I think that there's some good effects work in this one, some good camera work, although it's Freddie Francis, so you expect that. And all in all, I really like it. I mean, it's a moral tale, much like, you know, many of the anthology horror films and stories are. As with the anthology horror comics from the 1950s, you know, they are telling these sort of moral tales, and it's normally about people that probably deserve, not necessarily what happens to them, but, you know, they deserve to get their comeuppance in some way, and that's what this story is really about. It's about a guy betraying his family, really, and what kind of happens to him because, well, related to that. So yeah, I really like the second story. I think it's very strong. In saying that, there's not really much to talk about. It's just a good yarn, you know. It's like a good horror short story or something like that. So it's enjoyable. The third story in Tales from the Crypt is, you know, one of my favourites in any anthology horror film, and it stars Robin Phillips, who plays this stuck-up guy who lives in this well-to-do area in a nice big house, but next door to him lives Peter Cushing's character. Now, I've said this before, Peter Cushing's in all of the Amicus anthology horror films, so he's the thread that links all of the films together. And in this film, he very much is the heart of the piece, much like the house that dripped blood. And in this story, Peter Cushing's character, who lives next door to this stuck-up idiot, And trust me, he is an idiot. You'll understand if you watch it. He's he's a nice old guy. He's a widower, and he spends his nights using a Ouija board trying to contact his wife. And but during the day he like builds toys for the local children. He has his dogs. He's kind to everyone and loving to everyone. But the stuck-up neighbour, played by Robin Phillips, decides that he wants Peter Cushing's character to move out of the house. And the reason for this is that I think it's that the outside of the house, or the it's maybe not as pristine as the other houses, and he feels like somehow he sees him as this sort of like dirty old man, like, and doesn't really want, not in a bad way, just mean like, he sees him as a guy that doesn't look as nice as the everything around him. So he thinks it brings down the price of his own property. So he conspires with his father to try and get Peter Cushing's character to move out, and they do this in a variety of different ways. They make him lose. They ask people in the council to make sure that he loses his job, so they do that. They take his dogs away from him. And they send them all of these Valentine's cards on Valentine's Day, loads of them, all saying horrible things about him, and they spread a rumour about him and the children, sort of maybe implying that he's maybe a paedophile or something like that, and all the mothers keep their children away from Peter Cushing's character after that. So he's really heartbroken, and it's I don't want to ruin it, I don't want to ruin what happens, so that's as far as I'll go with the synopsis of this story. But it's really heartbreaking. It's probably the most touching story within any anthology horror film, or one of anyway. It's brilliantly acted by Peter Cushing, as always, and Robin Phillips really sells his characters. This little stuck up idiot, and it's got a fantastic conclusion to it. And it's there's some good effects in this episode. There's and it is actually, the end of it is, I found it anyway really quite frightening. So it's a definite must watch. The fourth story in Tales from the Crypt stars Richard Green, and it's really a retread of the famous Jacobs short story The Monkey's Paw. Now, in The Monkey's Paw, well, I won't tell you The Monkey's Paw, I'll tell you what this story's about, but trust me, it's a very sort of similar story. They even mention The Monkey's Paw, and it starts off with Richard Green, who has been told that basically he's going to be ruined financially. Now he's obviously lived like a very affluent life, and when he's talking to his lawyer, his lawyer does say to him, you've trampled on a lot of people to get to where you are. So that's the only sort of tenuous link to him being a sort of, bad guy, so to speak. But then what happens is that him and his wife start talking about how, they're going to have to sell everything, lose everything, or be declared bankrupt. And the wife mentions this ornament that they both bought abroad, and at the feet of the ornament it has an inscription which is half worn off, but actually says that the ornament will grant 3 wishes to the owner. So if you know the story of The Monkey's Paw, it doesn't end well. So that's, although it's not exactly The Monkey's Paw, it's just the idea of getting the 3 wishes, and everything that they wish for somehow is cursed. There's some sort of loophole which is always exploited, and that's really what the fourth story is about. I think it's quite horrific. Some of the ideas in this one are really horrific, and some of the things that happened in it, I really found interesting. However, there's one point in it where some of it's a little bit campy, which is normally not a bad thing, but there's an effect which is similar to the effect that was used at the end of Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, when the big reveal, so to speak, and you see this with a character on a motorbike, and it's just kind of, I don't think it's particularly frightening or anything like that. It just kind of looks like a guy in a mask. So I still enjoyed this though. I think it's a good story. The fifth story is probably my least favourite. Even though again it has heart, unlike a lot of anthology horror stories, it stars Nigel Patrick, and it's about, well, Nigel Patrick plays a sort of major or retired major from the army, British stiff upper lip and all that, and he's actually been given a job as the manager of an old folks home, and the old folks home is for the blind, and he stays there in the old folks home while he's managing it, and he stays there with his Alsatian, and his Alsatian dog sort of guards him, obviously, as Alsatians do. So the story is really about how the people who are staying in the old folks home are treated really, really badly, and one of the members of the old folks home actually dies because of them not putting on the heating and all that sort of stuff, not feeding them properly, and the blind people who live there decide to have their revenge. It's just, I think that the revenge is very elaborate. It's like the A-Team, and I think that's maybe part of the problem I've got. But there are actually similarities between this and maybe something like Saw, so you could draw a comparison between this story maybe having influenced like James Wan, or influenced maybe a film like Seven, or it's got that sort of feel to it in some places. It's still a very strong story, but I think it's just that the stories in Tales from the Crypt are so strong that it's just, to me, I don't know, it seemed over elaborate, and it just seemed like it, not that any of it is realistic, but for some reason it didn't feel as believable to me as the other stories. So in conclusion, with regards to Tales from the Crypt, I think this is a very strong anthology horror film. I think the wraparound is weak, unfortunately, but really the whole idea of Tales from the Crypt, I suppose, the Crypt Keeper was someone who would introduce stories. They didn't quite do it that way, and yeah, I just felt that it wasn't, the wraparound wasn't as strong. But I think the containing stories, it has some of the most famous stories, and one of my personal favourites in the story about Peter Cushing's character, which I was talking about. So I think really it's a real must watch within the Amicus series. That being said, it's one of these films that I can watch, and I can see that, right, the direction's good, the stories are all good, they're all strong, but it just didn't resonate with me as much as Dr. Terror's House of Horrors or From Beyond the Grave. So I don't know, it's not quite one of the best in my opinion, but I can understand why some people say that it is, because it has almost everything bar the weaker wraparound. But anyway, but I would say, despite me saying that, it's still very enjoyable. I think you may watch it and think that it's great, so I would definitely recommend it. And now I'm going to go into the spoilers section of this video, so if you haven't watched it, go and watch it, and then come back and watch the next part of the video, because I am going to talk about, I'm going to ruin the film basically. Okay, so major spoilers. I think that the wraparound story, like I talked about a minute ago, I said that it's quite weak. I think the reason that it's quite weak, when we see how it ends, where it's like, yes, this is actually not your future, this is your past, because you're already dead, that sort of idea had already been explored quite substantially in the Amicus series, and it was one that they retread again in later films, and that's the only thing that sometimes bugs me about the Amicus films. As much as I love all of them, sometimes I think a little bit more thought could have been put into the wraparound stories. So I think that's what's quite one of the reasons that the wraparound is quite weak. I think that there's not much interaction at all between the crypt keeper and the tourists. There's really very little. There's a very sort of dodgy effect at the end, but again, that normally doesn't really annoy me because like I love older films and I love optical effects, you know. So even if an optical effect doesn't look nearly as good as some CG effects, I actually probably prefer the optical effect. So it's the wraparound's not the best. I think when they have Ralph Richardson's character turn around and talk to the camera again, that's, you know, let's see, we'll go through it again. That's you know, every film apart from Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, where there's one point where it's almost like he's talking to the camera but not quite, just before the end. Like all the others, Torture Garden ends with Burgess Meredith's character talking to the camera. The House That Dripped Blood ends with the Stoker character talking to the camera. And then you've got Asylum, where the orderly sort of nods and looks at the camera as he's talking. And we have it here with I'm forgetting which film I'm reviewing, Tales from the Crypt. So again, they had that, and it's the way the delivery of the line as well. Who's next? Perhaps you. You know, it's kind of funny, you know, I suppose, but I just thought it was overplayed. The first story I thought had a really great twist to it. The idea of, you know, the child letting in the maniac because he's dressed like Santa Claus. I thought that was really great. I just always thought the punchline to that story, where Joan Collins is being strangled, it just didn't look right. There's something about the shot that I think it. Sometimes I wonder if it was like a fluffed take. It just doesn't feel like he's really doing it, you know. The second story, I think, was really well done. Like I said, you know, earlier, you know, I said there's like makeup effects in this. The reveal, the punchline, I think to this is really well done. Kind of, you know, you might kind of see it coming, but I just like the way it all ties up. You know, that the mistress is blind, and so she's the only one that he can sort of go to without her reacting right away to his appearance. And then when he looks in the mirror and sees that he's, you know, he's been lying dead for like however long it is, 12 months to 2 years or whatever it is. I really like the second one. I don't know, I kind of get a wry grin when the main characters sort of going, what's wrong? What? You know, it's really, you know, why is everything different? You know, it's like, I don't know why, it just kind of makes me laugh. That was a really bad impersonation though. With the third story with Peter Cushing, I've already said it's, you know, one of my favourite stories, and I think that, you know, first of all, again, the makeup, I really love, like, zombie Peter Cushing. Did you ever think you would see zombie Peter Cushing? I remember watching this for the first time in years, maybe about 10 years ago or something like that, and I remember seeing it, and all of a sudden I saw zombie Peter Cushing. I was like, that's amazing. The makeup I think is really great. I think what ruins it a little bit is there's a close-up shot right at the end. See when you see him rising from the grave and all, that's great, you know, it's really creepy, it's really, you know, you're like, oh my god, you know, it's really frightening, I think. But then at the end, it gets too close to the camera, and you can kind of, you know, because it looks like his eyes have rotted away, and there's just the you know, recesses of the skull, and that's all that's there. But when he goes close to the television screen, you can see that there's something, you know, blackened there to make it look that way. But I thought that everyone played that story to absolute perfection. The only problem I have with it is that at the end, just the logic of the scene, and I know we're talking about anthology horror and really logic should go out the window, but I mean, if a father finds his son dead, he should be absolutely hysterical with grief, and you know, he takes the time to read the note that Peter Cushing's been read, you know, and then the beating heart and all that. I don't know, maybe he doesn't realise that he's dead, but he's covered in blood, and you think he wouldn't be sitting there reading the note, he'd be like trying to wake him up, or you know. But other than that, I think it's heartbreaking. It's one of my favourite stories, but the funny thing is, because I think perhaps because of, you know, we've, you know, well, most people have had, you know, sort of grandparents, and we've seen the elderly, you know, struggle on, and especially when they lose their partners and things like that, that I think it's hard to watch. It really affects me, but it's absolutely brilliant. What I was talking about earlier on with regards to the fourth story was the sort of spectre of death on the motorcycle, and you see the skull, and I always think when you see that close up of the skull, it's like, I don't know if they were thinking that it would kind of just be like a helmet. It's meant to look like a motorcycle helmet with a skull face on it, but you can see the guy's eyes, the skin of the guy's eye, and you know, I always look at it and I just think, you know, just blacken that up, you know, do a bit of Batman, you know, when he puts the cowl on, blacken that up, and then you don't see the skin. I just realised I'm saying blacken that up, you know, that might not be politically correct, but you know what I mean, like just put the makeup in there so that when the skull's on, it just looks like all there is are the eyeballs. So that effect didn't really sort of work for me. Again, it's something that I think if you'd seen it from distance, it would have been better. But I do think that, you know, like, 'cause there's things that like I really love about like anthology horror films is when you're like, something happens and it just gives you a little glimpse of something, but you're like, well, what was that? I want to know more about that, but it doesn't tell you anymore. And in this story, you have that when the wife wishes her husband back to life, and all of these sort of ghostly undertakers appear. Who do they work for? You know, where did they come from? You know, that I found that creepy, that whole idea creepy. And then the idea of the guy like lying there, being brought to life, and he's got embalming fluid all the way through his veins rather than blood, and that he can't die. You know, she tries to chop him up. It's great. You know, it's absolutely in the spirit of the original story, The Monkey's Paw. And the funny thing about it is most of the story takes place in a room, but you know, it goes along nicely. You know, it doesn't drag or anything like that. And yeah, I really enjoy it. When I said earlier that I thought the fifth story was a little bit unbelievable, what I meant was the whole thing where they, you know, force the major down, this guy who would be a trained soldier, you assume, against, you know, the people there, but they're blind, they can't see him, and they sort of force him downstairs. And then the whole elaborate thing where they've, you know, got the two rooms next to each other, and they built in this corridor that only goes between the two rooms with razor blades all on the walls, so that when the major comes out and he cuts his hands off the razor blades, he then goes into the other room and his Alsatian's there who's been starved for days, and then eats his owner. I don't know, it's just, like I say, it's like something out of Saw, and it just feels a little bit too elaborate, that's all. But you know, the performances are very good, and again, you just get so angry at the major, but not that I think he'd deserve to be eaten alive by his own Alsatian, but you do sort of like, you get so angry at, and because there are so many sort of nursing homes out there, which there are some great nursing homes out there as well, but there are ones that are people in the care sector who don't show the level of care that they should. This has become a political video, not a film review. So all in all, it's a very, very strong entry in the anthology horror series, and it's a definite recommend from me. So go and watch it, and as always, check out the forums below. Let me know what you thought of the film, and that's about it. Bye for now.